to our session. Thank you for joining our second Connectory Global Talks. My name is Veronica Rodriguez and I'm from Guadalajara Connectory, and I just would like to say a few words. So this event is our Connectory Global Talks with the topic of the future of mobility and post-pandemic trends. Today we have speakers invited from different Connectory locations from Chicago, Curitiba, Guadalajara, and London Connectory. If you have any question during the discussion, please feel free to post them in the chat. Today, Mauricio Laborati will be our moderator.
So I have three guests today. I would like a brief introduction from them. Giles from London, Alejandro from Guadalajara, and Fidas from Chicago Connectory. Please, Giles, can you introduce yourself?
So again, thank you for inviting me this afternoon in London. My name is Giles Bailey. I'm an entrepreneur, run my own consulting company based in London. I do a range of things for clients in the UK, the rest of Europe, and around the world, helping largely around new mobility trends and strategy. But I'm also the head of partnership and policy for Vianova, a French-based micromobility company, as well as a university lecturer part-time at the University of Warwick. My background is at Transport for London in the UK, where I worked for a number of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Giles. Alejandro, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Alejandro Saniger from Bosch, Mexico. My background is as a transport consultant and transport modeling and simulation. I'm trying to work now in introducing more sustainable ways of mobility into Bosch, Mexico, and in general in our environment.
Okay, thanks a lot, Alejandro. Fidas, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Firas. I work at City Tech Collaborative here in Chicago, which is a member of the Chicago Connectory. I work on solution development, resident engagement, and thought leadership. Specifically focused around mobility and our new parking lab that we have, a Millennium Gateway Innovation Lab. Prior to my role at City Tech, I worked as a mobility expert at UN Habitat and was based in Nairobi. So yeah, it's a pleasure to join you all, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Okay, so let's begin. Thanks a lot for the introduction. Everybody can place questions in the YouTube channel. And I will begin warming up with a very provocative question. Maybe Giles, you begin, then we change the sequence along the whole conversation. We do that in an organic way, I would say. So how are the immediate reactions caused by pandemic on transportation? How do you believe it will mobility sector look like after the crisis?
Okay, so again, quite a wide-ranging but interesting question. And I'll give you my reflections and thoughts on what's going on in London and the UK, but more widely in Europe and broadly around the world. I think the first and most important way of thinking of this is that we have a series of overlapping crises that have come to the fruition as a result of the pandemic, and quite different reactions to the world of transport and mobility. Clearly, in many economies, to deal with the pandemic, we've had to suppress mobility effectively to almost zero. And again, it was something we thought practically you couldn't do, but many, many economies have had to do that. How that plays out, for example, in an outer suburban area, in suburban England or any other country in Europe, people have not traveled. And when they need to travel, they're actually traveling increasingly by car. Public transport exists, and while important, is more of a fringe issue in many of those suburban and outer suburban areas than the core of public transport. And yes, people are walking and cycling more as well. How it's playing out in a larger city like London, though, is actually quite different and problematic and interesting. Again, we suppress transport, but it isn't feasible, possible, or any way desirable for vast movements of people to occur by cars. And in fact, for example, in London, a third of the population doesn't have a license or access to a car, and that's nothing to do with economics, that's choice. So as we get back to some element of mobility, the question is, how do we encourage and sustain people using public transport, and what the level of use of walking and cycling will be as we go forward? Clearly, there's a push to walking and cycling, but the numbers clearly aren't there versus the prior use of public transport. And that comes back to many, many other aspects, but the one I particularly get to is, what do large urban centers actually look like going forward? London, Paris, Barcelona, Vienna, they're all based on mass movements of people into the city center for work, for leisure, for tourism, for many, many things. And without that core public transport network, it's hard to see how those cities function and get back to any version of normality. And that's certainly the crisis that's playing out in London at the moment. I'll stop at that point to give you a few thoughts to kind of mull over.
Okay, that is an interesting equation because from one side, people have to keep safe distance, social distance. From the other side, and then the trend looks like walking, cycling. Yeah. So the buses, no longer buses or subways no longer seem to be viable if they are not being used fully. So that's an interesting equation. Alejandro, do you think such a move, such a trend also can happen in your region?
Yes, I'm based in Mexico City, and here in Mexico City, 75% of people use mass public transportation to move, or they were using it before the pandemic to get to work. So the city heavily relies on, especially the subway system and some other public transport systems around it. So we, at least in Mexico City, it's difficult to think of getting back to normal without using public transportation. So yes, I think local governments have to think on how to compensate for this revenue that these systems are going to lose at this point, because we still need to offer them. Going a little bit backwards on this issue, I mean, I first think it's useful to consider what the scenarios could be in the next months or years. And I think, or especially thinking on how this and when this could end. I think I have thought of three scenarios. First scenario is if we get like a vaccine. We would all like to get that vaccine soon, of course, but we have to think of be realistic on how when can we get it. I think the best case scenario would be at some point in the first half of 2021. Because we need to think that this has to be accessible for most of the planet's population, and that's not going to be, that's a great challenge. A different scenario is if we get not a vaccine maybe, but better treatments which could reduce the mortality of this pandemic, and in that case we could start thinking of going back to a new normal slowly. And the third scenario is just a slow adaptation. If we don't get any vaccine or treatment that is successful, we just have to see how to keep on going with our normal, with our lives from now on, with measures that we can take to protect ourselves. And basically we're on this third scenario right now. Hopefully we'll move to another one at some point. But we're in this scenario and we don't know for how long, so we have to think on this scenario, I think, for the time being. And yes, public transportation, as you mentioned, is a big issue, and we have to think about people need, first of all, to to be able to meet their basic needs. So they have to work in many cases. They have to travel. So the first question is whether you're going to travel or not. And there are some issues here. Some people can work from home, but not everybody, especially people in lower incomes, people who do work at factories or do cleaning and maintenance for facilities, or I don't know, pack food. All these jobs can be done from home. So these people normally have lower incomes, and they're going to be exposed to a larger risk, I think. So, government has to think on how to protect people, but also to reactivate economies in this sense, and be as sustainable as possible while doing it.
Yes, your three scenarios takes into account that you cannot avoid the massive usage of public transportation.
At least mega cities, yeah.
Yeah, at least in mega cities. And so the solution, or the solution in the moment for London City, which is a little bit walk and cycling trend, is not feasible. So that's the first point I would like to highlight. Is not feasible for all cities, and mainly the mega cities. When I think about São Paulo, for instance, they are a little bit more. There is a trend to cycling and walk, but the public transportation still remains the mainstream transportation mode. Firas, in your case, in the U.S., as maybe you can talk as a whole, U.S. has a very particular transportation behavior. Everybody has a car, so in the big cities, how do you see this trend? Mainly considering the three scenarios that Alejandro pointed: vaccine, no vaccine, treatments, or lower the curve of infections. How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pandemic has really affected the public's trust in public transit and using public transit, and that's led, like everywhere else in the world, to plummeting public transportation ridership. We've seen a bit of a difference between rail and bus when it comes to public transit. Since a lot of US cities were planned around the car, we've had pretty aggressive transit-oriented development plans surfacing within the last 2 decades. And you start to see a divide there, like Alejandro mentioned, among class, where the educated urban professionals who are located near the train aren't taking the train. And so we've seen a decrease of up to 90% in our central business district in Chicago. In more residential areas, it's more toward between like 40 to 75% of a decrease. But at the same time, a lot of our buses are continuously overcrowded. And it's becoming an increasing challenge to maintain social distancing guidelines while people who depend on the bus to access the grocery store, to access primarily low income wage jobs are still taking the bus. So we do see that disparity among different types of workers and in different neighborhoods. As Giles mentioned, we have seen an increase in bike and micro mobility mode share. The city of Chicago particularly is trying to stock more or create more bike storage, install more bike sharing and e-bike and e-scooters within the city. The first e-scooter pilot we had was last year, and it's been renewed this year, and the scope has expanded significantly across the whole city. So in the bounce back, I think the vaccine definitely determines whether or not people will take trains and come back to trains in the future. I think another big issue to highlight is the trends of work, and a lot of offices are rethinking their leases and structured start times, and so I think this leaves a lot to the imagination of how people will be commuting, taking trains and buses too. But it's just, I think a lot of it will have to depend on what employers have in store for their return back to work too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I can take as a takeaway from this question, the behavior of the population has been changed during the pandemic, during this pandemic time frame we are living now, and we cannot avoid that these people will go back to the traditional transportation mode, because many of them depends on that for the daily work, and mainly in the big cities, like Alejandro said. But some people that probably will feel comfortable or more used for other transportation modes, modal of transportation, will probably migrate because it's they get used. So some people that didn't have a bike or has a station with bicycles near home for the last mile will probably get used to that. So we cannot avoid this transformation now, as I can take from you. But the massive depends on vaccine, depends on the treatments to go back to the previous transportation model. I would like to motivate all the audience to place questions. Also, I'm following here the YouTube besides me. You can place your questions. I'm going to the second question, but I would like to have questions from your side as well. So now maybe Alejandro begins. Is the crisis a call to adjust the business models? How the solution providers and transport operators might be reacting to that?
Yeah, I think local governments have to be very active now in getting involved into new business models with operators and private providers so that they can all work together. I think we can divide this into different modes of transportation. Of course, if you do nothing, probably the alternative for people who are not being able to use buses or subway is right now to either get a cheap car or a motorcycle, and that's what's most likely to happen at least in many Latin American cities. If local governments are not active, this can have an impact on congestion and, of course, on safety and accidents in the case of motorcycles. So I think it's important for local governments to get involved and try to do something in this scenario. And many cities understand that, so they're trying to do something. In the case of micromobility, I think it's one of the most sustainable alternatives to using mass public transportation. But there are some changes to consider. Before, we have considered micromobility mostly as a last mile solution for short trips, and now I think we have to think of it more of as a door-to-door solution to be a real alternative to public transportation, at least for people who are most likely to use this kind of transportation. So we have to think about providing for longer trips, and that in many cases requires some infrastructure for this kind of mobility. And we also have to think about maybe shared bicycle schemes and things like that, especially for longer trips. I think electric bikes and have a very interesting role to play, but they are not easily they're not affordable for all population or for a great number of people. So some kind of shared bike scheme has to be introduced, and we just have this, like, I I think we can call it a failure of the dockless bikes, which were provided by completely by private companies, which we had a lot of them in cities, maybe in 2018. Then 2019 was not such a good year, and then we're seeing almost nothing right now when we need them the most. So I think the business model that these bikes were having were, I mean, apparently was attractive at the beginning because city governments didn't have to put any money at all, which was a great innovation at the time. But then we saw that those business models were not as strong as thought. And in a situation like this, with a pandemic and with all private companies having problems, they don't want, it's not easy for many companies to invest a lot of money in new schemes right now and to take risks. So I think the government has to get involved, and some public money would have to go into it. But public and private sectors need to work together there. So basically, I think that it has to be systems that maybe are publicly planned but privately operated. And thinking more on these long trips, maybe instead of charging per minute like many of these schemes were charging you, they have to charge, I don't know, per day, per week, per month, so that once you pay for this, you use it for as long as you want. And for long trips, the other way around, there was a lot of pressure to get fast and to not use it for long trips because it could get very expensive if you use these bicycles for long trips. So that has change, and the infrastructure is important, of course. So the affordability of these schemes have to be also an important issue if you will want a lot of people to get into them. And the area where these schemes work has to be much wider, because in the past they were mostly focused on business districts in the city center, so that was okay for last mile solutions. But then now we have to think about longer trips, and we have to think about larger areas. And I don't know, in the public transportations, there's this revenue loss that it's going to be important for governments to attend, because otherwise companies are going to get in trouble. So we still need those services, but we need less people on them. So it's a difficult equation, but the government has to figure out how they're going to manage that. And as more economic activity gets in, I think we also have to think about tools like congestion charging or low emission zones to try to keep things sustainable and not get more congestion in cities than we already used to have.
Yeah, you can think everybody alone in the car or in a motorcycle. Each one has one in Mexico City. It's gonna, or São Paulo. It's gonna be a real mess. So that's the equation that the government has to work with the private companies. They are in a bad situation now. I can see here in the city, we use it to have the scooters and the bicycles. And now they are all prohibited currently due to safety reasons. So they don't have revenue at all. So what to do with that? Yeah, that's a bad situation for these private companies. And one side, if the government doesn't support such a business model, the streets will be crowded. Nobody goes nowhere. And so I think this equation has one solution, but you know, political decisions always are very complicated. Firas, what also in your region, the public transportation is not as strong as in other big cities, because the culture of North America is everybody has a car. But in the big cities, I think you will have the same situation. You mentioned already some of this new transportation model. And what do you think the business for those companies will change, public and private companies?
Yeah, before the pandemic, we already were seeing a lot more willingness from the public side to participate in public-private partnerships. And I was reading today that the New York Metropolitan Transportation Agency, the transit operator in New York City, is losing $800 million a month due to the pandemic. So, I mean, the creativity behind financing, behind creating public-private partnerships and cooperation is definitely necessary going forward. This isn't necessarily, I mean, $800 million a month, that's not a problem that a municipal budget can solve. This really, like Alejandro mentioned, takes national effort, especially with the economic crises and that are happening across the world, and in the US with our unemployment rate as well taking a big hit. Traditionally, what happens when you have large unemployment is you invest in infrastructure. And I think in the US, for instance, we could hopefully see more progressive sort of regional transportation connecting our cities across the country like we see in Europe. So that's one thing. I do definitely see a lot more activity. I mean, let me take a step back, in that the crisis has shown that public transportation is a necessity. It's something, it's a public good, and oftentimes private sector actors don't understand that, and we've seen that sort of in the airline industry, where it's sort of completely crumbled, and we don't really know how that's going to bounce back, right? And so our urban transportation networks and systems are crucial to providing a service to the public. So we can't necessarily replace public transport with private services, because if a private company goes bankrupt, then there's no more transportation, but transportation is vital. So we would need to see some types of interesting public-private partnerships in the short term, just to facilitate that gap that we have until there's a vaccine, to sort of complement our public transportation networks if they do become overcrowded, or they continually pose to be a public health risk. Some previous trends before, I mean, connectivity, sort of creating more seamless transfers between modes, between private modes to public modes, sort of trying to feed public transportation networks through micromobility. That I think that needs to maintain and even pick up during the crisis. To be able to try to figure out ways that private sector actors can feed into the spine, which are the rail networks and bus networks of cities, can be a good first step. But I think anything should really be founded on the fact that public transportation is a public good, and it's a necessity during times of crisis. It's a necessity during times of growth. And so I don't think we should lose sight of that fact.
Okay, thanks. I will take the chance, Giles, since the question coming from Chicago has something to do with the business models. So how do you think the mobility of 2025 would look like in the mega cities in an ideal state? And how would the crowdsourcing impact global mobility, in your opinion?
So again, I mean, from both of the other speakers as well, some really interesting ideas. And if I, to 2025 or even to 2021, it's kind of a lot to plan. But one of the things I would say is that because there are a series of multiple crises, I don't think we should be looking at immediately going back to, quote, normal. So I actually don't think we're going to. And I say that particularly around the world of work has actually changed. And so many people have realized, for good or for bad, they can do things locally or work from home. Not everyone, but that said, lots of businesses are reinventing themselves to be able to work remotely. And even look at this webinar today. And what that means many, many things for transport and business models in the future. I would argue it means a lot more local, regional transport around your neighborhood. And that's possibly very good for public transport, new uses of buses, new uses of local light rail and local systems. And actually, I think it's actually very important for micromobility as well, in terms of personal use of cycling, or even personal e-scooters, but actually shared micromobility in a local context as well becomes more and more important. Clearly, there will be those longer distance trips into city centers and intercity as well. And those systems are important to support in terms of public transport in the short term, but actually in the longer term to make the economy work. But again, how we reinvent, support, and encourage this localism in economies and mobility becomes more and more important. A number of things in there. One is clearly hygiene. For all these business models, how do we, in the longer term, frankly, assure people that the systems are clean and safe because they are clean? But also how they work together, critically important as well. How we share data and insights to allow them to work effectively together. Many, many things need to be thought through to enable that kind of model to work. And sorry, the key one I wanted to mention was space, particularly in congested urban centers like most European cities, how we reallocate space to enable sustainable local transport to work, and whether that's walking, cycling, scooters. Frankly, we have to restrain a potential growth in car traffic to enable these sustainable work modes to work. And because frankly, again, people cannot drive en masse. Our cities simply will not work. So again, a number of thoughts, again, on this kind of rolling crises. Can we even get to 2025? Let's look at 2022 and 2021 to start with.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot. I go briefly to a question from Ervin to Alejandro. If the teleferic in Mexico City is one interesting public transportation during and post pandemic.
Yeah, in the peripheries are I don't know. I think they have gone more into local economic activities. Actually, you can see in Mexico City, people from higher incomes are like in their homes, and they have had probably less degree of illness from all this pandemic, but it's hitting harder all the people in the peripheric areas and lower incomes, because I don't know, because they have, number one, they have to I mean, they don't have any savings. Their economic activities is based on doing their job day by day, so they can't afford to just stay home, and they can work remotely. So it has had a higher impact in these places. But they're probably working more locally and traveling, in some cases trying to travel a little. Those who are, I mean, we have in Mexico City also, on the economic side, we have like the formal economic activity and a lot of informal activity, where people are not under a contract, or they're just trying to solve their lives day by day, maybe in different areas. So people have to just figure out how to do it when they're working in these environments. And most of them travel long distances on the subway for especially those who have a formal job. So in some stations in Mexico City, you have seen like these crowding situations. However, the government, a good thing about this government is city government that is currently the current administration is that they have tried to put more focus on what's happening on the periphery and maybe less focus on the city center, which has historically been the sector of the city that attracts more investment. So that's natural. I think that happens almost everywhere. But the government has made an effort to bring some of the investment to the periphery, and some of the projects are helping there. They also building some cycleways in the periphery, which was not done before. I think those have been some good things that are helping. But as economic activity builds up, it's going to be a real challenge, because right now we don't have crowded public transportation systems and we don't have congestion, but we will have. And how you allocate space on the network is going to be key to push people to a more sustainable and maybe safe way of transportation, or not doing it. So the city still has a lot of challenges. They're doing some things right now which I think are good, but they still have the biggest challenge is still ahead, I think.
Okay, thanks. I think the takeaway of this question about the business model, I will summarize. Depends on the architecture of the city, depends on the suitable solution, if it has a space or not to be applied, and it depends on the partnerships, private companies with government policies enabling them to place their business as a support for the public transportation. This is kind of, it fits, there is no solution. The equation is the same, but not a single solution. I would summarize like that, because each city has the proper challenges, their proper culture, behavior, and not an easy equation to solve. But one thing is important to take away is this collaboration from government with the private companies, private transportation companies, micro transportation, and also the transportation for long distances. So thanks a lot. I will ask Firas to begin now. Maybe there is one important question that I will do together with this one. What temporary adaptations do you think will become permanent, and how the new generations play their role on this transformation? Because they were coming with a different behavior, like not a car, I prefer a bicycle, or I prefer go walking. What do you think? And then all these private companies came up with business models to support that transformation all around the world. You can see in Germany, you can see in the US, in some cities, you can see also in São Paulo, Mexico City. So a lot of examples arose during the conversation. So what is these two variables play a role together? Adaptations that will become, in your way of think, permanent, and that with the new generations coming with another behavior. What do you think?
Yeah, in terms of what adaptations will become permanent. The other day I was just walking outside and thought I was in Denmark. I was like confused, and all the bikes, you never see this at this level. Even in American cities that are super congested and bike friendly. I do think that the reopening of many American economies now, especially in the urban centers, which suffered the most during the first wave of COVID, having the openings coincide with the summer time here has really helped foster a better bike culture and more sustainable modes of transportation here. I think this will really stick with a lot of people to realize how easy it can be to move around the city without a car, and even without getting on public transportation for that matter, to just bike around, to take a scooter or an e-bike, and all these new technologies that are at our fingertips to be able to use them. And as Giles mentioned before, the localism has really also taken on here. People are just going on walks, experiencing things in their own communities. And I think this is things that they may have lived here in their neighborhoods for 5, 10, 20 years, and they haven't even noticed these things, which is a good sign, and is a great thing to sort of become more of a permanent fixture. And in terms of just some of the business models, I think, as I sort of alluded to before, I think a lot of private sector actors cannot be seen as competition, but rather something as more of a collaborator with public sector transit agencies. So to really work on helping solve the problems, because during a time of crisis, this is the time where people ideally should lose or sort of come together to solve problems collaboratively as a group. And so I really think this could be a new way of fostering relationships between both the public and the private sector, in terms of just collaborating, working on common solution development and product development together, identifying public needs and working towards that, rather than exclusively being seen as competition. And I think a first good step with this is sort of just putting data out there to really understand what the recovery is like, and when cities are coming back to normal, and being able to set benchmarks that way. And I think that benefits, one, city leaders, but also two, it helps establish industry benchmarks that can even help investors confidently understand market size or market share within a lot of private sector companies. Because as we've seen through like the IPOs of Uber and Lyft, a lot of these numbers are inflated and there's no real data behind it. It's like you don't know what to trust and how much market share, how many rides are being given. So I really think creating more of an open space to really discuss whether or not our cities are coming back could be a first step towards that collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there is a question about the contagiousness of the disease. A.O. Robinson is asking. Maybe Giles, you can begin. You can give your opinion about that. I think we talked a little bit about this change of behavior, with a little bit more with the companies with a little bit more care about cleanness. Do you think it's gonna last forever, even after the pandemic time frame now? So the way they clean, they keep all the, not only the public transportation, but also this sharing, mobility sharing solutions. How do you think they will adapt themselves from now on?
Again, so a very interesting question. Clearly, I'm not a medical expert. And in some ways, the way I like to look at it is no one can see the virus. You can't see it kind of coming at you. But I think the key question, though, is, or the key output, is people are very concerned about cleanliness and hygiene. And the whole pandemic has just raised this whole issue. And that isn't going to go away. And coming back to the world of transport, for operators and for how we look at and plan and manage transport, we need to be and demonstrate that as providers, we are reflecting the needs of people's concerns about cleanliness and in our business models and in our operations. And that will be around space. And over time, whether it's 1 meter or 6 feet or 2 meters, people will be concerned about crowding as well. And we need to kind of offer them solutions that reflect those needs of cleanliness, space, that they're rigorous cleaning regimes, that we know and offer services, again, that look at those kinds of needs. And again, that will push more and more people to consider micromobility or selective use of longer distance transport when they have to. But also, I mean, transport is a derived demand. It also will reflect in terms of how people think and when they need to travel. And this will spiral on and on into almost every aspect of our lives. Do we need to make that journey? Yes, I might want to make it, but do I need to? Can I do this online? Can I, meet my friends online? Can I do lots of things online and travel very, very selectively? And again, that will change how our cities are structured and used. I don't think it's all negative. For a whole host of reasons, it can be positive, but again, quite evolving in terms of how our systems are structured.
Okay, thank you, Giles. I will jump to Alejandro, taking already your point, Giles, about this new behavior. So Alejandro, what do you think? I will ask you personally, what are you doing now and after, and what are you doing? What are you thinking to do after the in 2021, if the vaccine comes and you go to the normal life? What are you doing to think? Or what are you thinking to do? And what would you advise to other people after this time in your region?
Well, if we manage to get, I think we have to consider that also people have been under a lot of stress. So if there was like a scenario of a vaccine where everybody could get back to normal, I think the first reaction of people would be to try to do all those things that they weren't able to do before. So everybody would try to meet and be together if they feel it was safe again. So there's like this urge of people to try to get back at their normal lives if they can. But on the other hand, I think, but that's only on that scenario. If we get like a perfect solution where this pandemic is not a risk anymore. If we don't reach that point, if there's always certain level of risk, people will have to contain and be aware of these risks all the time and take decisions being aware of those risks and trying to reduce them and everything. So I think we have to, I mean, as the transport planner, something I wanted to comment as well is that, like Giles said, it's very difficult to think now of 2025, where we have to think on a very different scale. And that's why transport planning in a traditional way doesn't work anymore, probably for the time being. We have to do a lot of trial and error, or local government especially have to do a lot of trial and error to see what works and what doesn't, because it's not like we can spend, I don't know, 6 months making a plan, because by then everything will have changed. So we have to be a lot of very, very dynamic. And there are some challenges to do that. Probably from the government perspective or bureaucracy, it's difficult to move fast, but they're going to have to do their best. And I don't know. I think from the original answer, that from the original question, I think people just have to. I think we have to get back at being productive, but make a good assessment of all the risks that we take and tackle them as wisely as we can on the way. So it's like opening our minds, try to do things differently, and very open on these aspects, I think. So many people should, for example, try to travel in different ways to the ways that they have always done it. Some people have done it all their life in the same way. Maybe they have always used a car, or they have always used public transportation, and now they're gonna have to face change. But let's have I think governments have to help a little bit in people to start thinking out of the normal way of doing things. But that can work. I think one of the positive sides of this pandemic is that we have all changed our behavior. That was seen as a very difficult thing to do before this pandemic. Transport planners have to work a lot to just get very small changes. And now we are all aware that we have this great capacity of adapting and changing, and we have to continue making use of that for the better.
Thanks for your answer. Firas, are you buying an electrical car, or what are you doing to get a sustainable transportation for you itself now in post-pandemic time?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time for sure, in that it's almost a time to test. I mean, it's a limited time frame, and there's a number of solutions that can be tested to see whether or not they work and whether or not people adapt to them. And I think the key is really providing more supply and making it as easy as possible to take alternate modes of transportation. And I mean, we're seeing that with the e-bikes, docked bikes, e-scooters, all these different modes that will one day make it easier to transfer more seamlessly onto public transit once it's safe to take it, and people are back into trusting public transportation systems. So I think adding as much as you can to the supply, testing it out, it's sort of a transportation planner's dream, in that everyone is willing to test new ideas and see whether or not they work and they catch on. I think being a bit preemptive and limiting demand by congestion pricing, as Alejandro mentioned before, I think congestion pricing can really take on a lot of gains here, in that, I mean, especially in America, where there's a fear of a Carmageddon coming back into the cities, as we've made so much progress to transition more towards public transportation, to really create the frameworks and mechanisms to test whether or not congestion pricing might be able to work within our cities. And I guess in the last key bit is that within the public and private, there's so many blurred lines here, but I think the key takeaway here is that they need to be more complementary instead of competitive, and being able to recognize that public transportation networks are still the main sources that we should channel our investment into, and improving those public transportation networks is fundamental. But there are many ways that we can work towards providing complementary services, and that's what we're doing here at City Tech Collaborative. We're working with the Chicago Transportation Agency to help understand how congested buses are, to maintain a 15-person per bus quota, so that once a bus reaches 15% or 15 people, we can send another bus. So creating these operational tools to make public transportation better and more efficient is really a key step forward that I hope will continue to live on after the pandemic.
Yeah, I've heard about this new idea of for safety reasons to keep the distance and not impact on the accessibility of people to the public transportation. So automated systems that will recognize someone is waiting to get into a bus, has time to get to the work, and that is a trend. Another trend I would like Giles to approach that. Another trend that I've heard recently is that people are afraid to get into crowded areas, risk areas, and they want to drive alone. So some car makers are very happy to hear this trend because they would sell more cars. Do you think car makers will sell more cars from now on due to this reason, even with the impact on the big cities, traffic jams? Do you think this trend is real? It's gonna happen?
So absolutely, and there's statistics in the UK certainly that show that some people feel driving personally in a metal box, a car, is one way of isolating yourself from COVID. But that is unsustainable. Unsustainable as a way of mobility. But I think the broader question is unsustainable for the planet in terms of climate change. We simply can't run cities, and I think we almost realized that 20, 30 years ago on mass movement of people in cars. And I'd actually argue that the car manufacturers broadly realize this as well, which is why they've been investing in electric vehicles and other forms of mobility for the last decade. So it might be nice to sell more cars in the short term and make a little bit more money. But for our cities to work, as Firas was saying, and Alonso as well, we need sustainable mobility, we need public transport, we need micromobility, and we need that to work very well across all of the ways and means for getting around a city in a dense network of opportunities and options. And yes, cars have a role in cities and more generally in mobility, but that role needs to be selective and managed, and whether that's via controlling the amount of space, congestion charging or road pricing, or even outright bans for certain vehicles, as we've seen with diesel and petrol vehicles as well. That fundamentally is the way to go. And that's also the fundamental way of avoiding the next, well, or dealing with the next crisis that frankly is going to be climate change inevitably.
Okay, thanks. We are getting to the end of our global talk. I would like to begin with Alejandro. Last words about the trends, the mobility trends post-pandemic, maybe in your region or in general. Can you give us some last words about that?
Yes, I think mode share is inevitable. It's going to happen because the priorities of people have changed. And I think it's up to all actors in the mobility sector to try to make that mode change as efficient, as sustainable as possible, but also obviously protecting the health of the people. So we need to balance these things. I think we all have to be very active in proposing these new business models. For example, we're working as Bosch, we have a cooperation agreement with the National University, and there are a lot of into the subject of e-bikes and what role can they play in this post-pandemic crisis, and I think there are are very interesting things. So we have to work a lot of in communicating these things like we're doing today, in making partnerships with academia, with private operators, with governments, etc., to try to bring people who have experience in transport and together and try to think of what the solutions for the next couple of years can be in these different scenarios. But I think we have to be very active, and I think doing what we're having this conversation is part of that, and hopefully some ideas can be shared and those can be brought into real life solutions for people.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Alejandro. I'm summarizing here all the points as much as I can. You can add in the YouTube as well if you want. Firas, please, your last words about trends on the future mobility for post-pandemic time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest challenge going forward is regaining the public's trust in public transit, and I think that really is centered around providing better service. And not to belabor this point, but I think congestion was a problem before COVID, like overcrowded buses, overcrowded trains. This is why people would avoid using public transportation. This has been exacerbated now that there's public health guidelines that limit congestion on buses and trains. So I think using the pandemic as a sort of an accelerator forward to finally solve the problem of lessening congestion on buses and trains can lead to really lasting impacts on service delivery for public transit agencies. And I see this I'm hopeful that this will occur, that, after the pandemic, after things are back to normal, that congestion it remains sort of, I want to see people going back to buses and trains, but that it's not so much of a chore to get onto public transit, and whether that's through connections to public transit or just that the bus that you get on isn't crowded, there's a seat for you. So providing that level of service to residents in cities is something that I'm hopeful for.
Okay, thanks a lot. I added that as a takeaway as well here. Giles, maybe your last words about these trends.
Okay, thank you. And again, I'll finish off where I actually started. There are a series of multi-layered crises. And certainly for some people, this has been the worst 3 months of their lives, and they just want things to go back to the way they were in February as quickly as possible. But one of my reflections is, and I see this from speaking to people around where I live in suburban London, it has been very odd, but not that unpleasant. And again, I'm not just saying that myself, lots of people have said that to me. And I think people's view of transport and mobility has fundamentally changed, and how they need to travel, how often, and in what ways. And because of that, I think as Alejandro was saying earlier on, the needs of transport in cities has evolved. And yes, there will be those core trunk needs of heavy rail systems into central areas, but there will also be now quite a different view of how people want to live their lives and what kinds of transport they will need. And that is a huge opportunity to rethink our cities. And as Firas was saying, actually just make them much, much more pleasant and give people many more opportunities to live and work in different ways, locally with scooters and cycling, and be more selective in how they think about life. And hopefully in the end, that is actually not a bad thing. It's probably making society even better.
Okay, thanks a lot. I will summarize the takeaways here. Business models depends on the private and government partnerships. People will avoid crowded and risky places as much as they can, and new safe ways to move depending on the distance. because there are last mile and there are big distances, so they will be more conscious, more aware about these contamination risks, at least in the short term. There will be a new normal. Some behavior change will last, like people never drove a bicycle before, and they found out that it's possible to go to the work, and they will no longer use other transportation modes. So that's one example. So Giles, you said people will figure out safer ways, will adapt themselves, and maybe they don't come back to the new norm, to the old way. Government will need to review its transportation partnerships, because maybe the transportation, public transportation itself doesn't pay off. Transportation modes have to be accessible, like the example that Firas brought. Some intelligent algorithms or intelligent solutions to keep people moving in a safe way. The partnerships have to be complementary instead of competitive. So micro transportation have to have the support of the government, of the city administration, because they have to have the bikeways, the walkways implemented. So this is the kind of partnership I'm talking about. Car makers will probably sell more in short term, but use car as a safety box is not sustainable. It's not sustainable because of the not only pollution, global warming, but people simply cannot move because so many cars will not move in the big cities. Yeah. Transportation architecture has to be suitable for each city in an intelligent way. So we saw different examples here. They don't fit as a solution for all equations. So people like us, we are thinking about intelligent ways, intelligent technology solutions, not only for mobility, but also for the urbanization, have to be more active, listen each other to implement the best cost benefit way of transportation, of architecture for transportation in the cities. So this connection is very important. The public transportation will be avoided in the short term, but in the long term, it will still play a key role in the big cities. As I said, maybe with another architecture, maybe with other intelligent solutions. So this is from my side the main takeaways from our conversation. I have no other questions here. If you read that and can also give your opinion, be my guest. It's gonna be very, very good to hear your last words also in the YouTube. And thanks for everyone who took part on the live stream in the YouTube. And we keep in touch. Thanks Firas, thanks Giles, thanks Alejandro, thanks Marco Knaben, also Mrs. All the people from Guadalajara who organize it, and see you soon if possible. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Well, good afternoon, good evening.
Have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Have a nice time. Take care, yeah?
Bye-bye.